And the reality is that we're not doing particularly well in the grand scheme of things. We're still on a decline in America. And the trend is downhill because it's exponential. Growth is exponential in movements, but decline is also. It starts doubling up. So Barna can state that in 20 years we'll have 50% less church attendance. And whether he's right or wrong on that, it's certainly the trend is there. So the problem for us is that the best forms of church that we've got to address the situation can maybe reach into what I would say is, in America, probably 40% of the population. That is the current form of church, the contemporary church. And we are, the seeker-sensitive, or however you want to name that, can reach into a segment of the population that would be within the cultural orbit of that church. Is I think 40%. But the problem is that most of our churches are geared towards that segment. So here you have 95%, maybe more of our churches trying to reach 40% of the population. Well, that's a problem. And here you have the situation is that you've got 60% of the rest of the population who not. That model ain't going to reach them. Because if it was, it would have done that already. What about the 60%? Well, then you say, well, more of the same is not going to get the job done. But it's on the decline, folks. We're designed for advance, not defense. We're an advancing body. And I don't mean to be triumphalistic about it, but I think the gospel is the triumph of God in Jesus Christ, and we are meant to represent that. And the church is an advancing body. If we're not advancing, there's something we're doing as leaders, as people who've got something in our hands to do. Because I think we can trust that Jesus has built-in potentials in us that will create community, will create movements and advance. And again, movements understand that. They just connect with that powerful transformative force, which is the gospel. And out it goes. Yeah? Because actually I do believe that recovery of being movements again, I believe that actually the recovery of that form will be part of the answer, and a major part of the answer for the problem of the church in the West. The apostolic genius is made up of 6 elements, hinting at the kind of DNA of the church as a movement. I saw it as a system, as this dynamic kind of relationship of various elements that came together, that if one was removed from the equation, you don't go there, you don't go to exponential movement. Remember, that's what I'm trying to dig in here, is how do church movements grow exponentially, reach what Roland Allen calls spontaneous expansion of the church. At the heart of the church and the heart of God's people is this innate capacity that God has built into the church. That is the combination of these elements. And here's the theory, is if one of them is missing, you don't go exponential. It doesn't matter which one you take out. All of them are needed to create exponential movement. So, you know, it's the actual irreducible minimum of what movements are made of in terms of the dynamic system. Okay, so overview of the 6 elements very quickly is that the centerpiece around which the others orbit is the Jesus is Lord piece. So here you have is a worldview in a sentence. Actually a worldview in 3 words, which is quite remarkable. And that's why it's kind of theologically dense enough to hold the movement together. So that's the heart of it, is that centerpiece. The next one is discipleship and disciple making. That is, it's very close to Jesus as Lord, because this is how the individual believer lives out the Lordship of Christ in community. Discipleship and disciple making are foundational to any movement. No matter which movement you observe, you will find that they're obsessed pretty much with discipleship and disciple making. Everyone's a disciple and no one ever stops being a disciple. Then the other one I go to is missional incarnational impulse. God is a missionary God. The church is a sent people. We see in Jesus the kind of model of mission. You go among a group of people, you speak from within them. If God is a sending God, this is how God sends. Missional incarnational go together. It's the outward and the deepening impulse that associates with movements. And here you actually see the sneeze being worked out. It's like as it establishes itself and then it sneezes out. The following one I go to is apostolic environment. If we're going to be a missional church and a missional movement, we have to have missional forms of ministry to go along with that. Ephesians 4 expresses that the church has got 5-fold form: the apostolic, prophetic, evangelistic, pastoral and didactical, the teaching role. And I think a lot of the frustration at the moment in missional church circles is everyone wants missional church, but they don't want missional ministry. I would say if you take this out, you can't have movement. Then we go to organic systems. Organic systems has to do with the organizational structure of movements. Movements that go spontaneous and exponential, they have a very decentralized form. Power and function are distributed outwards. Every agent has got the capacity to reproduce the whole. And then we have communitas, which is the final piece. Communitas is a community formed in the context of an ordeal, a challenge, a task, a mission that requires each player to find each other in a new significant way to get the job done. Friends become comrades, team players. All movements that change the world seem to have a comradeship and a sense of each other's backs that we tend to lack in Western expressions of church. We can't think of these as silver bullets, each and of themselves, but we need to see them as a kind of living system, each independent and interrelating with the other pieces. You change one, it changes the whole. All six need to be present, and I would argue are present in every church, but are forgotten, hence the book, The Forgotten Ways. They lie underneath, dormant, but they're there and they can be awoken, and that's our job. At heart, the Jesus movements are people movements, that is, everyone gets to play. Every believer carries the potential for world transformation in them, every single one of us. And we don't even have to be long in Jesus to actually carry all the potentials of the whole in us. Every believer is a church planter. Every church is a church planting church, right? Which is to say that everyone carries the potential for the whole in them. And that's one of the most amazing things. As a spark has a potential for a flame, as a flame has a potential for a fire that consumes a forest. In a seed is the potential of a tree, and a tree is a potential for a forest. But it's all contained in the spark, or contained in the seed, in potential. In the same way, every believer carries the potential of the whole in us. If we, for a moment, began to kind of wrap our minds around that, you realize that you look at any church and you see this is a kind of a massive amount of seeds in here. Every one of them has the potential to be a church, and ought to be a church planter. And every church that comes out of them ought to do the same. The significance of Jesus for movements is very, very important. You cannot overstate that. The centerpiece around which the others orbit is the Jesus is Lord piece. I phrase Jesus is Lord because the movements themselves actually use that terminology, and it captures an incredible amount of theological density, as well as it's very light and can be sneezed. That is, it's an idea, well, it's three words. I mean, you can sneeze that anyway. Anyone can get that. And it's got a little, you can sing that thing, it's a slogan, yeah, Jesus is Lord. All great ideas, when they're really good ideas, are like viruses. That is, we get infected by them. They get hold of us. You know, we become a carrier of a virus, like an idea, and then we, of course, being infected, we go and infect other people. So we sneeze on them. So I like the idea of the whole movement ideas of Jesus sneezed, which I rather like the phrase, that, you know, Jesus sneezed on a group of people in ancient Israel, and you know, it's still sneezing out now, you know, because the gospel, in a sense, travels like a virus. Jesus is Lord, of course, has got this capacity to be sneezed. It's a simple, what I call a simplex statement. It's simple because even a peasant can get it, you know, a theologian can get it, but it takes a lifetime to live it out. In fact, none of us will ever kind of get to the depth of it, because it's really about the kingdom of God, or the sovereignty of God, or monotheism, as you might say it in the Bible, that the absolute claim of the one God over all his creation. So here you have is a worldview in a sentence. Actually, a worldview in 3 words, which is quite remarkable. And that's why it's kind of theologically dense enough to hold the movement together. So that's the heart of it, is that centerpiece. Jesus is Lord. Sociologists do call the early church and movements like them Jesus movements, because they have a very simple adherence to Christ that lies at the heart of it. A very uncluttered theology. It's not saying that that's the only theology we should have, but it's the central determining theology, the gateway to all other theologies that should inform all other ways of thinking about God. For us as Christians, the truth is Jesus is like God. But the greater truth is that God is like Jesus. The Christology should inform everything for us. And Christology is how we think of Jesus. It's the whole phenomenon of Jesus. Not just his death on our behalf, that's as vital and as atoning as that is, our salvation events, but also his life, his ministry, the incarnation, which we've lost a sense of what that means. Significance to mission is massive. We need to take the whole phenomenon of Jesus seriously. That's why it's center. Christology lies at the heart of the renewal of the church in any time and any place in which we find ourselves. Lost, identity crisis, struggling to know our cause and our function in the world and what this thing is all about, we go back to Jesus to find that out. Where else do we go? I mean, he's the founder. He gets defining rights. You take the words of Jesus seriously. Man, they call into question so many of the things that we take seriously. This is not a nice guy speaking. This is a Lord. And we've made him just into this decency cop. You know, he's not that at all. You know, he's a Lord and he's a master, and he challenges our idols, which are very many. The reason why we try and marginalize Jesus or domesticate him is because it's hard to live with a Lord. Lords are very difficult, right? They're masters. They claim absolute loyalty, particularly biblical ones. I think that behind any attempts to kind of moderate or change Jesus is that desire to kind of qualify the demands of discipleship on our lives. We just qualify him down until the lordship means nothing. So we can still worship Jesus, but he has no significant lordship, no impact upon my life. And I would suggest churches are masterful at this. Because we domesticate him, it's hard to live with a Lord. He's demanding. And you try and follow Jesus, you know, the closer we get to him, the more dangerous he is to our middle class sensibilities. And what we do is we slowly and surely take him out in every other sphere until he becomes just a religious God. God has no relevance to any other aspect, economic or political aspect of our life, or any other things. The people of Israel struggle under the sovereignty or the kingship of God, and so does the church. And so even the church itself, in the book of Revelations, there's, you know, the famous Laodicean church where you have Jesus knocking on the door of the church, asking to come in. I mean, it's not about evangelism, Billy. Actually, it's about Jesus being locked outside of his church. You've got to ask the question, what's he doing on the outside when all the people are worshipping him on the inside? Because in actual fact, they've marginalized Jesus as reality out of the church, and they've retained a certain idea of Jesus, which they think is a modicum of civil religion on the inside. By the way, the Laodicean church is America, of course, because it's the church that had no need of anything. It's an opulent, well-fed, and, you know, in a very wealthy city. And they've lost their first love, their defining love, you know, and he calls them to repent or he's going to take their lights out, right? We don't let God have his way in our lives. Because, to be honest, he's ravishing. He'd take over. And we're scared of that. We're rebels. We do not like that. We fear that he's going to undo us, and yet, you know, he is good. But he's dangerous. But he's good. And he's not safe for us. He isn't. And yet we need to learn to live under the unsafe but good God that is Jesus. Yeah? We can trust him utterly, but he's not safe. Not if you want to be middle class and secure. It's a very challenging thing. And yet, if we don't grapple with this, then we miss the whole point of it all, which is about Jesus. Our legitimacy comes from Jesus, and I think, you know, we learn this from movements, but it is our message. It's our most fundamental story, which we must return to find ourselves again and again and again. So discipleship and disciple-making is foundational to any movement. No matter which movement you observe, you will find that they're obsessed pretty much with discipleship and disciple-making. Everyone's a disciple, and no one ever stops being a disciple. And it appears that if we fail at this point, we have to fail every way. If we don't disciple, then the culture sure will, and it's doing a good job of it. And so we have to disciple over against the prevailing religious energies and powers of our day, which is, I think, the power of the market to determine our lives. The thing is, we're being profoundly discipled every day by a very sophisticated system called media and advertising. Trillions of dollars are put into it to manipulate our sense of self, who we are, our sense of worth, our identity. This is the task of advertising, is to create desire. It's really about desire. And if religion is anything, it's about desire. So that anyone who comes to Jesus in a Western context is already a well-discipled consumer. And it's a religion. Consumerism is being defined by what we consume. It is like I said, the search for meaning, identity, purpose, and belonging, tied to the consumption of products. The problem is that I think that consumerism is the alternative religion of our day. Without doubt, is the secular religion of our day. There's no such religious force in the West as powerful as consumerism. For me, the most simplest definition, I think one that gets to the core of what discipleship's about, is becoming more and more like Jesus, like the one I love. The way we worship Jesus is by obeying him. He calls us for utter obedience, because in the Hebrew mind, the way you worship is to obey. It's not simply giving words, it's actually becoming like. In a sense, my becoming like Jesus is what I'm designed eternally to be like. When we shall see him, we shall be like him. Look what the early church does. They grow like wildfire because they got disciples, not consumers. You cannot build a church on consumers. They will desert you at the moment's notice because they have no commitments beyond their own needs. You can't build on that. Jesus is quite wise in this. You can take his advice quite seriously. Quite literally. Die. Jesus can take 12, and by extension the 70, and build a movement that changes the world on disciples. He could never have done that on consumers. You've got people who are willing to pay the price. They've already died to their own agendas. They're now living for the Lordship of Jesus. With that, you can build movements. The following one I go to is the apostolic environment. If we're going to be a missional church and a missional movement, we have to have missional forms of ministry to go along with that. Ephesians 4 expresses that the church has got fivefold forms: apostolic, prophetic, evangelistic, pastoral and didactic, or the teaching role. And I think a lot of the frustration at the moment in missional church circles is everyone wants missional church, but they don't want missional ministry. I would say if you take this out, you can't have movement, because God has designed the church in its innate design to be a movement, and that part of it, being a movement, requires that you have more than just status quo forms of ministry like the pastor-teacher. You need the apostolic form, the generative form. You need the prophetic form to keep faithfulness. You need the evangelistic form to recruit. And these, together with the shepherding form, which creates community and love, and the teaching, wisdom and understanding, create a far more dynamic way of sustaining and generating movements, and I think we need to recover that. In recovering the fivefold, we have to create a new climate of legitimacy by allowing people to talk about it. We're not trying to reinstitute the 12 and the significant place that the 12 play in forming the church, but we're trying to extend the ministry of Jesus in fivefold. Incidentally, on that, by the way, if you look at Jesus and the fivefold, you'll see, is Jesus the apostle? Yeah, pretty much so. The sent one of God? Yeah, betcha. What about a prophet? Is he the prophet? Yeah, he's a great prophet, right? Is he evangelist? Sure. Is he a pastor? Oh, yeah, best pastor in the world. Is he a teacher? You betcha, right? So in other words, Jesus expresses his ministry through the body of Christ in fivefold form. So when you limit the fivefold, you're not expressing the full ministry of Christ. You can't. I use the term apostolic because it's the catalytic one. It's not the most important, it's simply the catalyzer, God's catalyst for the others to kind of come into being, and therefore provides a significant role in, particularly in movements. Remember, that's what we're looking at, exponential movements that really go kaboom, right? A spontaneous expansion. If we want to talk about missional church, then it seems to me that we have to have a missional ministry to go with it, and that we have to therefore begin to embrace the term apostolic with all that that means, or else we can't go there. And why I say that is because the two are actually one and the same. The word missio, of which we get our word missional or missionary from, is translated into English as sent. It's the Latin word which is the same root of the word apostello. Sent lies at the root of what it means to be apostolic. The apostle is the sent one. The two are one and the same. To talk about missional church and not wanting to talk about apostolic ministry, I think it's doomed to be a frustrating discussion, and become just a discussion, because it can't become a reality, in my opinion. If you want missional church, you have to have a missional ministry to go with it, and you have to at least include fivefold, and you have to start finding a way to talk about the apostolic as the catalytic piece, because if you don't go there, I don't think you can have missional church. I don't think it's possible, to be quite honest. The church is missionary by nature, and that's the big thing we need to discover, that at the core of who we are is we are a group of people who have been captured by a story and a part of the unfolding of that story through our lives. We are missionaries at the very core of our being. Then we go to organic systems. Organic systems has to do with the organizational structure of movements. Movements that go spontaneous and exponential, they have a very decentralized form. Power and function are distributed outwards. Every agent has got the capacity to reproduce the whole. You will find that movements that change the world tend to have a vibe of the movement side, the beginning side of the equation. What I call a transformational vision for the world. They believe their message and that their job is to deliver the message. The structure of a network would be another factor in living systems and organic systems. A starfish, if you cut a leg of a starfish, it grows another leg. The piece that you cut off grows into a whole new starfish. Chop it into 10 pieces, you've got 10 new starfish. In other words, a starfish has a structure that any segment of it, if it was removed from the main segment, has got the capacity to reproduce the whole segment, the whole thing out of it again. And I think there's the metaphor for what movements are like. It's a metaphor that makes sense of movements that say every believer is a church planter, every church a church planting church. That is, everyone has got everything in them to get the job done. That God has designed us in a certain way, that each of us carry the potential of ecclesia. There's a movement in you and me. In potential, it needs to be developed out of me yet. But there's movement in every one of us. In multiplication movements, if something goes wrong, it's self-disciplining. That is, eventually it might affect 2 or 3 cells around it in terms of churches that it might have planted, but then sooner or later the whole body kind of clears. And your body does this all the time with cancerous cells. Interestingly, in the West, where we've got massive centralized systems, are we free from heresy? And you look around and think, oh, I don't think so. You know, with all our control systems, all our seminaries, all our kind of headquarters, all the kind of ordination ceremonies, all the stuff we seek to control, we're far more heretical. Centralized structures are more vulnerable to heresy than decentralized structures. A centralized structure attracts people who like power, and often people who are wrong, and it only magnifies the influence throughout the system, because what happens at the top is affected right throughout the system. And so having all the seminaries in the world and everything, you know, that the West has got has not kept us free from being heretical, and very heretical at times. It's the vibe of a movement, structure of a network, spread like viruses. It's a pay-it-forward movement. And the mathematics is simple, that if all we did was win 3 people to Jesus in a lifetime, by discipling them into the kingdom and keep on discipling them afterwards, and all we require of them is to win 3 others in turn, you know, to love 3 people into the kingdom of God, and keep discipling them afterwards, and they do pay it forward all the way down the line. Literally, in America, you know, if the base group was 40 people committing to do that, and you gave it something like 25 iterations, you would have pretty much covered the population of America and beyond. 37 years for the entire world. You begin with the end in mind. You know, we plant a movement, don't plant a church. And so multiplication must be factored right into the beginning of the equation. Spread like viruses, right? So even if we just did that, drop everything else we do, and just start a discipling movement in a pay-it-forward style, you pretty much get it done. Get her done, as you say here in Texas, get her done. Right? Then the other one I go to is missional incarnational impulse. God is a missionary God. The church is a sent people. We see in Jesus the kind of model of mission. You go among a group of people, you speak from within them. If God is a sending God, this is how God sends. Missional and incarnational go together. It's the outward and the deepening impulse that associates with movements. And here you actually see the sneeze being worked out. It's like as it establishes itself and then it sneezes out. Further and further. So missional incarnational is not only a statement of theology, of the most profound theology of the church, mind you. Missionary God, incarnational God, pretty profound, important stuff. But it's also about our methodology, following the missionary God. We are sent into the world, we abide. You know, it's not missionary go home, it's missionary stay home, or grow home. Grow your home where you are, among a people, love on them, and you know, witness from within to the love of God. If missional is the fact that we're sent into the world by the missionary God, and we represent him in every sphere and domain. It's the kind of the sneeze outward as it multiplies itself. What you'll begin to see that in any given setting where the seed takes its ground is pushed into the ground, into a cultural ground, and it grows up from within. Incarnational follows the act of God in the incarnation of Jesus. That is, God becoming one of us, and I'd like to say completely incognito. It was 30 years in the neighborhood and no one notices. I mean, what does that say about God? I don't know. Most people don't think about that, but you say, well, this is the God who creates the universe with words, a being of unbelievable, incomprehensible power and intelligence. And he's in the neighborhood and no one notices? Come on! You know, it's the most subversive of all biblical doctrines. What kind of God is this? That he'd come totally and completely incognito, a schmuck like one of us, right? He just looked like us. No one noticed. Even his disciples don't get it. They only get like glimpses and then they go back to their kind of, duh, you know, they don't get it. But in actual fact, it's the biggest compliment he pays to us, right? Incarnation is the compliment he pays to our humanity. But not overwhelming us with cosmic laser beam light and power shows with, you know, stun us into believing. He invites us through love and through sacrifice into a relationship with himself in Jesus. This must change us. This is how God engages the world. Therefore, we must engage the world in the same way. It's the pattern. That's why I bring the two together. And I think the church is now starting to talk about missional, and I think we're getting that a little bit. It's exciting. Here's the other piece. This is how we should do mission. Yes, we should do this, but this is how we do it. Going in a neighborhood, being part of it, speaking from within. We plant the gospel. We don't plant church. Actually, it's a big thing. Plant the gospel. Plant Jesus in the midst of a group of people and let the church grow out of that. Because the church grows out of the gospel. This is what it means to be evangelical. The evangel is the gospel. And so we should let Jesus do his work. Our job is to plant the seeds of the gospel, the story in a given people group, and let them experience the love of God in ways that are meaningful for them, not imposing our ecclesiology upon the top of them, which is what we've tended to do. So I say, following the mission incarnational impulses, that we learn, that we go to a context, we abide in that context. We don't know what church will look like until we get there. We haven't worked it out until we get there. You can only work out church in context, because church is a way that people express the love of God that is appropriate for them. You don't need a degree to be an agent of the King. I would say your baptism is your commission. The very thing that Jesus does is he commissions everyone. And it's not like people who have done any doctoral theses or anything like that. These are ordinary people. That's the power of Christianity, that we all are agents of the King. And then we have communitas, which is the final piece. Communitas is a community formed in the context of an ordeal, a challenge, a task, a mission that requires each player to find each other in a new significant way to get the job done. Friends become comrades, team players. All movements that change the world seem to have a comradeship and a sense of each other's backs that we tend to lack in Western expressions of church. If you aim for ministry, you never get to mission, even if you intend to do it. However, if you aim at mission, you get ministry as well, because ministry is the means by which you do mission. If you organize and rally around the flag of mission, that is what we do outside of the church in Jesus' name, you have to do ministry along the way, because ministry is the means by which you must do mission. In other words, you have to be loving, you have to be serving, you have to do it together in order to actually achieve your mission, because you're not going to achieve it otherwise. So communitas takes place along the way of trying to do something that requires that we learn to love each other in a deep and more profound way as a group of brothers and sisters who rely on each other very deeply and are very disappointed when someone maybe doesn't fulfill their task within a given framework, because we really do need each other to survive. I do think that Christians are very risk-averse, and churches are very, very risk-averse. They are not places that you normally associate with adventure or risk or creativity. Because here's the deal. If you want to be creative, you have to risk failure. If you want to achieve something beyond the status quo, you have to get out of the status quo, which means you're not going to make everyone happy. But the problem is, without that, you never go anywhere. And so you're stuck with the stifling status quo, which I think is what many churches are stuck in, because we've cultivated this kind of safety awareness, this middle-class obsession with safety and security. I'm afraid that that will kill us in the end. You know? A little bit of danger is good for us, a risk. It doesn't always have to be death-defying. Doing a job that pushes us out of our comfort zones is very good for us. I think that in America, we self-identify as largely a middle-class society. And like I said, there's nothing evil about being middle-class, but one of the bad things about middle-class culture is its obsession, safety and security, comfort and convenience, right? There's no question about that. That's the bad side. It's this need to kind of secure the kids, you know. But when that becomes obsessive, it's dangerous to the gospel, because it attenuates the gospel, because the gospel calls that into question. So what we do is we have to resolve the tension, and we usually do it in the name of the family. So the gospel becomes this kind of civil religion that really just affirms my lifestyle. So I think that what a middle-class America, therefore a middle-class church, easily co-opts Christianity to be the civil religion. And it's really the country club atmosphere, no threat. It's just nice, safe, it's just part of my world, it's my religious aspect of my world, but I don't experience adventure or journey or quest over there at all. But real adventure, real journey, real quest, where we're stakeholders in the outcome, where our bodies are on the line, I don't think so. It doesn't happen very often. It's good for us. If it doesn't kill you, it's going to make you a lot stronger, but it could kill you. Let's acknowledge that. But you don't have to be that far out where you know, it's like death-defying, but I think you've got to put yourself out a little bit. But the wonderful thing is you'll learn and you'll find Jesus in new ways, and you'll learn to trust God in new ways too. And let's see what God can do through us.